how to create art in Blender that looks like that Arcane style that we all know and love. Let's get into it. If you want to download this finished Blender file or any of the other project files on the channel, you can do so over on Patreon and support the channel. For starters, we're going to go to the official Blender add-on page and download the super cool Painterly add-on for Blender that's called UQ Paint. Basically adds like Photoshop layers to Blender and makes this sort of art style way easier and more achievable. There's also Brushstroke. It uses like complex geonode setups for a Painterly effect, but using that add-on would be for an entirely different video on its own. So for this Arcane style video, we're going to be using UQ Paint. The latest version as of this video is 2.31, so go ahead and get that downloading with the link in the description. Next, you probably want to grab a few custom brushes for Blender. You can make these your own. You can find a few for free, like the one I'll link in the description and use in this video. What else do you need? Well, basically any old computer built within the last 10 years. A fresh install of Blender is almost always preferred, and a drawing tablet like the one I have here is definitely nice to have. And if you're going to be doing a lot of hand-painted textures, I'd highly recommend one. I'll put a link to a cool one in the description, but it's not entirely necessary, and you can definitely follow along with this project and create your own Arcane style art with just a mouse and keyboard. Then you just need a model to paint, materialize, and render. So for this, don't use the default cube, it's just awful. Actually, we'll just drop the default cube in a Blender box to destroy it, while I whip up a model that we can actually use for this Arcane style project. I used mostly basic box modeling techniques for this. If you're interested in learning more 3D modeling, I have a number of tutorials on CG Geek for that. I decided to create a version of the rock monster slash blue sentinel, the rock creature that's based off of the League of Legends video game. Yes, I do play a little. I basically just started by making some low poly rocks and kind of started piecing them all together, adding some sharp edges, working my way down the model, and then just coming back and adding some nice little details like engraving some runes in on the rocks. Using reference for modeling like this is great, but always do something to kind of make it your own and it will feel a little bit more special to you. Then just adding some finger rocks and little finger toes and wait, what the heck? Okay, so the default cube managed to escape this time. Won't be so easy next time! So, a few important deets now on your model. You'll want to have it UV unwrapped. It's easy to do if you're not picky about it, just hitting U and using a smart UV project on your model. And, this is important, you'll want to add a subdivision surface modifier. Change it to simple, then you can crank the render resolution all the way up to something like 5, but you don't have to do anything for the view to keep this nice and snappy in Blender, and it doesn't have to be applied or anything. It's only for baking textures later on. And we'll start by installing UQ Paint into Blender. It's super easy. You just go up to Edit, Preferences, switch over to Add-ons, click the little drop down there and choose Install from disk, locate the UQ Paint file.zip that you downloaded and click install. Now that's installed, you want to install the brushes that we downloaded. For this, you're going to go back to your user preferences as well, down to file paths, and then under asset libraries, click the little plus button there, locate the folder for the brush pack that you downloaded and unzipped this time, and click add asset library. You'll see it there then in the asset libraries, and if you switch over from object mode to texture paint mode, switch from all libraries over to that basic brush pack that you downloaded, you'll see that you have those new unique brush tools in your asset tray. Now, let's give UQ Paint a little test whirl. You hit N in your properties tab and it will pop up along the sidebar here as UQ Paint. Just select that tab. All you're gonna do is test it by clicking quick UQ Paint setup, add the basic PBR material setup that it has here. Then to do some painting, just click the plus button on the layers, add in a new image. The basic settings are great, as long as you have your model unwrapped. Pick a color, pick a brush, and start painting. Play around with the strength and radius, but you can see that it's working great. Here you can see the difference between painting with a mouse, a pressure-sensitive digital pen. You can paint lightly, and then when you press harder, it will give a darker and larger stroke, mimicking a real marker. Whereas if you're just using the mouse and keyboard, you kind of have to fake this effect as you paint by using different opacities and different radius sizes. A little bit more work, but totally doable. With our tools ready and at hand, it is time to go ahead and paint and materialize our rock monster sentinel creature thing here in Blender. For starters, you want a basic lighting setup. You want a basic lighting setup in Blender for your materials so you can kind of see what it's looking like in real time. You can just uncheck Scene World up in the settings here and then choose from a few of the different HDRs that come with Blender here for lighting. I'll just choose the forest one here with about medium strength. Then hitting N for your properties tab and bringing up UQ Paint, we're going to add a quick UQ Paint node setup to our model. Now before we get to texture painting, you can do a lot of procedural material generation with UQ Paint that helps speed up the workflow, basically just cutting back on a lot of the detailed painting and have it kind of do that on its own. Also can add some really cool details and sort of that shading that's oh so perfect in Arcane. So after creating a basic UQ Paint node setup, you can see we basically have our same PBR material setup if you're familiar with Blender's materials. And then we have layers. I'm going to click the plus to add in a new layer. Here you have the option to add new blank layers, generated layers, or bake layers. This is where we can have Blender do some of the work for us with generated layers. So for this first generated layer, I'm going to choose Edge Detect. I'll increase the radius just a little bit, something like 0.08 to 0.1 is good, and then click OK. And this looks kind of cool actually. But the purpose of doing this is I'm going to drop down the channel color here. This new layer is just affecting the color. I want this to affect the roughness. So the rock materials are kind of glossy on the edges where they're sharper and duller on the surfaces. And as you can see, it's kind of working already, but in the opposite way. The black areas right now are glossy and the white areas are flat. I want that flipped. So this is easy to do by clicking the little gear button next to your roughness setting and choosing to add a color ramp modifier here. Here you have a modifier that will affect the value now of the roughness. I'm just going to give it a 100% alpha opacity on the black, and then click the little drop down and choose flip color ramp. That takes away the glossiness like I wanted. And if I uncheck the color here, you can see the specular is a little hard to see on a white model right now, but if I brought the blacks in a little bit on this color ramp modifier and brought the overall brightness down on our model, you can see that the edges are shiny. The other thing I'll do is I'll select the white color and I'll take it down just a little bit. So there's a slight bit of glossiness to the whole mesh and it's not completely flat. Another little tip you can do that looks kind of cool with our roughness layer that we have here is you can turn on the color channel and then just turn the opacity way down to something small like a 0.1 or 0.2. So you get a little bit of lightness on the edges of your mesh as well as the reflections. And it kind of adds to that cool cell shading, arcane kind of style rock rendering. Now we're ready for another layer of material. So I'll go ahead and click the plus button. For this one, I'm going to open up an image. This is just a basic image of some cracked ground, pretty easy to find online, and I'll throw a link to it in the description as well. If you drop down your vector settings, you can click and drag the scale options here and change how much you want that to be repeated across your model. I'm going to go for around a value of 2 in this case, and then drop down the channel options as well. Uncheck it from affecting the color and check it on the normal map. Here you can see we got crackles just all over our mesh right now. It's kind of cool looking, but also a little bit too much. I just want these cracks to kind of be on the edges of the mesh, similar to the way the glossiness is on the edges of the mesh. By clicking plus on the mask option you have down at the bottom here and choosing Edge Detect. For this one, I'll increase it a little bit larger to something like a 0.2. And voila, you can see now that the cracks are just following the edges of the mesh. And then just like before, you can control this mask even more by clicking the little gear option here and adding a color ramp modifier to the mask as well. Basically playing around with the black and white levels will increase now the amount and the fade of the Edge Detect mask that we have set up. And you can do all kinds of sorts of stuff with these masks to make your materials more random and less procedural looking. For example, right now, the cracks are evenly dispersed across every single edge. If I go ahead and add a second mask, for this one I choose a generated noise texture, like I'll go to 4D and give it a little bit of distortion, then click the gear option and add in a ramp modifier as well, and crank those black and white values up a bit. You can see that because by default it's set to the blend type of multiply, this is just cutting back that edge detect mask a little bit and making it more random. So you get those cracks still, but you just don't get them evenly dispersed everywhere, so that's pretty cool. Now I'll add one more generated layer to our model. For this one, I'm going to go down to the generated layer and choose ambient occlusion. This was just added as a real-time option in UQ Paint 2.3. I actually had to refilm this bit because this was so new that it was just added into the add-on. It's pretty cool. I'll change the AO distance to something like 2 and click OK. Then I'm going to add a modifier to this ambient occlusion. We'll choose color ramp. I'll change it from linear to constant and then pull the black value back a little bit here. Then I'll take that black value and make it sort of a dark blue, maybe blue/green color here in my color picker. And once that's looking pretty cool, you can go ahead and click the bake ambient occlusion as image option. Go ahead and choose the bake device as GPU if you have a powerful GPU view that can be used for rendering. Once you have your ambient occlusion baked out of the real-time view, you might want to tweak the color ramp a little bit more. But you can see how that's looking pretty cool in the shading, and you can control the intensity of this layer by dragging the opacity value right here down to something a little bit lower, like 8.5 or 6. And using that color ramp on consistent kind of adds those straight shadow lines across the mesh, somewhat arcane-like style rendering, and also gives you some great reference for painting shadows onto your model, like we're going to start doing right now. Now it's time to whip out your digital pen, or you can use your mouse as well. So for starters, kind of lock in a base color for your model. In this case, we're going for this rock monster, sort of a dirty gray looking color on our main color here. And then under your layers tab in UQ Paint, click the plus button, and this time add in a new image. We'll give it a 2K resolution, but for larger quality models, you might want to go up to 4K. All the default settings here are fine in my experience, so go ahead and click OK. And then switch from object mode over to texture paint. Open up your asset library of brushes that you installed at the bottom here. Starting with the sketchy blue brush here, I'm going to go ahead and switch my tab from the UQ Paint now over to my tool settings here. I'm going to do this because I can go over here and create a new color palette. So these two tabs will be switching back and forth from a little bit, the UQ Paint tab and your tool tab. Here I'm going to go ahead and pick sort of a nice rich rock looking color. Once I'm pretty happy with the way that's looking, I'll hit the plus button on the color palette to add that color to my palette of colors.
So far, so good.
Using a brush size of around 100 pixels and a strength of around 0.2, I'm going to go ahead and add in a second material here, this one being sort of a darker, richer color, and just start painting in some of these areas on our mesh. Going for different gradients across our mesh, starting with like a lighter color on the edge and going to sort of a darker color along the crevices. I'm painting at a strength of about 0.2 because I like to be able to layer my strokes to sort of get that staggered gradient that will sometimes show your brush stroke through on the painting, something that you definitely see in Arcane's style rendering, but it's also just very versatile. Because I'm not the most confident painter, I like to be able to paint lightly. As I get more confident, add more and more strength to my stroke, I guess you could say.
It's quite the conviction.
As you can see, I'm just rotating around my model using the middle mouse button, or if you're using a tablet, I like to program one of the buttons on the pen here to be like the middle mouse button, so I can easily pivot around my mesh as I'm painting, adding some darker strokes in different areas across the back of the mesh, adding some new colors for some greenery in our palette here, and then using these for some strokes across the top of our mesh, sort of mimicking the way moss would grow on a rock in this case, and then going with more of a rich dark red color in some of the shadowier areas of the mesh. Looks kind of nice as well. And if you're not 100% confident on your style, some of this will be just trial and error, but there's nothing wrong with that. You can see what colors sort of tickle your fancy, and it's kind of fun to just turn on some music, let your imagination go as you start painting different colors in and see what looks good. Using the ambient occlusion as sort of a reference in areas where the painting could be darker, and then otherwise just adding some nice rock color strokes to different areas of the mesh to make it all seem sort of textured with these brushes. Painting somewhat brighter along some of the seams, as you can see here. And once you're feeling ambitious enough to start adding some details in, this is where it gets really fun. So switching back to our UQ Paint add-on, we're going to add in a new layer and a new image. This one we're going to name as our shadows layer, and we're going to change it from mix to multiply. Go ahead and click OK. Then jump back to your tool and add in a new dark color to your palette. I like to go maybe slightly to the blue hues for the darks here. Then I'll go into the contact areas of our mesh where there should be shadows and start going to town painting with this brush. Adding some crevices and whatnot throughout these low poly rocks looks kind of cool. Filling in some of the details around the fingers, really just kind of hand painting some of these shadows onto the mesh with this setup. The strength of my brush is a little bit stronger for this, but you can play around with whatever's looking good to you. And then kind of filling in some details as well. Like I'm going to take the mesh here and imagine some cracks along this surface. So making my brush smaller and doing some little detailed strokes in here, I'm going to throw some black lines down. On some of the other crevices on my mesh here where I think some cracks would look good, I'm going to go ahead and do the same, just painting in some crack lines. And then this is where it starts looking really good. You go back to UQ Paint, you add in your third, probably final layer at this point as a new image. Name this one something like highlights layer and choose a screen overlay instead of a multiply. Then back into your tool settings, we're going to add some bright colors to our color palette. These are going to be like some light, maybe creamy colored. I'm going to make my brush quite a bit smaller for these, and I'm going to turn the strength down to something fairly small like 8.2. And then I'm just going to hit some of these shadows on the edges with this light colored brush. And that really gives it sort of the displacement uneven sort of crack look in your painted textures. That starts looking really cool. You can see this suddenly gives those flat looking cracks some depth and also really sells the sort of hand paintery look to the model. Then I like to go to different edges of the mesh as well with some of those highlights and paint them in, kind of highlighting the different curves and cracks in the mesh. And at any time, you can go back to your base color layer here in UQ Paint and paint some more color back into your mesh if you feel like you're lacking color or contrast. And then I wanted to do more for the moss effect on the mesh. So for this, I'm gonna choose a different brush in our brush pack here. I'll choose the one that's the dots on the end here. I'm gonna make my brush quite a bit bigger and quite a bit stronger. And with sort of a desaturated green color, I'm gonna go ahead and splatter some of these colored paints on the top of the mesh, adding some more painterly-like details with this moss effect. And then to really add some definition to some of the 2D painted textures, I'm going to switch to the shadow layer, pick a darker green color as well, and paint some shadows on these little spots as well. I didn't do this to all of them, but just adding a little bit of shadow to some of these moss spots gave them a bit more definition. And while I was painting shadows, you can see some of the bump mapping cracks along the surface that we added with that procedurally generated material a bit ago. And I thought these looked pretty cool and I wanted to draw more attention to them. So I went ahead and drew some more cracks following these generated lines as reference, painting in some harsher shadows on those cracks here, as you can see, and then switching to my highlights layer again with a smaller brush and adding a little bit of highlight details to those cracks. You can see this started adding more definition and attention to those cracks, which I thought looked pretty good. Going to some of the rune inlays that I modeled in on this mesh and adding some extra highlights and shadows around these areas to draw attention to them. And what should probably only take you a few hours of painting, you get an effect that looks like this. Adding our base color layer in, adding those shadows, and then adding those highlights. And all together you can see it looks pretty cool. You want to check that things look pretty good while you rotate your sun lamp around as well, just to make sure the material's looking good in different lighting conditions. Also, to copy your material to different areas of the mesh, like this chest piece, which is a separate object, it's really simple. You just keep note of what your UQ material is called. As you can see here, it's called cube. Then you select your new object that you want to copy the material to, change it from whatever it is currently to the cube material, and then click the little 2 next to it to make it its own individual material. You'll see UQ Paint gives you this little warning that you have to fix the UQ Paint nodes. Go ahead and click that, and it will basically sort out all that for you. The only other thing you have to do is if you baked any of your textures, like we did here with the ambient occlusion, you have to go down to that layer and just rebake that ambient occlusion, and it's all ready to be painted now with some new painting layers. And that's the gist of creating these materials and textures for that Arcane style rendering. But I'm not completely done because I have a bonus tip for you. These are little details that are kind of specific to this project, but hey, they're pretty cool, and I figured you might want to know how it was achieved, so I'm going to cover it briefly.
Why not?
For starters, to kind of add some moss to this character that's actually a model and not just painted, what I did is I placed my cursor where I wanted some moss on my character. I go Shift A and I add in a plane. I double tap R to kind of rotate it so it's facing where I want the moss, and then I tab into edit mode and I choose subdivide 2 times. Then I jump over to my modifier settings and I add in a new shrink wrap modifier to this. For the snap object, I choose the object that I want the moss to be on, which is just the object cube, and you can see that snaps the mesh to the underlaying mesh. Now tabbing into edit mode and hitting O to turn on proportional editing, I just kind of pulled this mesh to be where I want the moss to be kind of hanging off the model here and give it a little bit of offset in your modifier settings here. Now with our moss layer selected, we'll go to the UQ Paint add-on and click a new node setup. The first step is to add alpha transparency to this, and this is something that you might be using in a lot of your different Arcane style renders, so this is why I want to show this step. Drop the color channel down and choose alpha. This will suddenly make your image completely transparent, which is exactly what we want, because now we can switch to texture paint, add in a new base layer, choose one of our cool brushes. For this one, I'll use the triangular brush, and then just start painting in on that object. You can see with the strength of about 0.6, anywhere I paint is essentially making that mesh visible with the green color. So I'm just going around and sketching out some moss onto our layer here, using a few different colors for some lighter shades of moss and some darker ones for some shadowy areas of moss. And once you have a basic texture painted out like I have here, you can tab into edit mode and duplicate that texture, double tapping R to rotate it around and having it automatically stick to your model in different areas. This is actually really handy and kind of a fun way to add material rendering to your objects. And so using just that one plane and that one texture that I hand painted, I went around and kind of dropped it in different areas of the mesh, as you can see here. You could of course add even more detail to this and get carried away with some really cool looking moss if you wanted to. And then the final icing on the cake for this model rendering was some of that glowy orb that the character character has in the video game. For this, it was really simple, starting with just a UV sphere. If you happen to follow my
Fiery tornado tutorial.
this is going to kind of be a similar setup to that, where I just start with a basic principled volume shader plugged into the volume output on our material. I have about 0.6 density and 3 on the emission strength with a little bit of a negative anastrophe. Then I just have a noise texture, as you can see here, with a little bit of distortion plugged into a color ramp that has the black value pulled up a bit. And all this is just distorted then with our texture coordinates. So I have a basic texture coordinate node where I separate the X, Y, Z, so I can basically take the Z axis into a math node, multiply it a bit by a value of about 7 in this case, combine it back with the combine XYZ node, as you can see there, and plug that into the rotation on a mapping node. It seems complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. All we're doing is modifying the Z rotation on our mapping. And as you can see by doing that, it kind of adds that spirally mapping to our sphere. And when that's plugged into the density of our volume shader, you can see it kind of gives that swirly orb energy-like look. I just dropped that into the center of our rock sentinel creature here, duplicated it a few times, and added a few emission spheres. And that's essentially the secrets and tips that I learned for how to create sort of this Arcane style looking rendering and materials. The UQ Paint add-on just takes Blender's default tools and makes them even more powerful. It's pretty awesome. But with those bonus tips out of the way, that wraps up this project. Again, you can download this finished file over on Patreon and become one of the channel supporters, which I am super grateful for. But aside from that, let me know if you had any questions in the comment section below or suggestions for the next tutorial. And that's all we're gonna have time for in this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!